Hello everyone. This is the lecture for the Unit 1, and this lecture has a twofold aim. First aim is to give you a basic understanding of what human rights are. I will try to keep it as simple as possible because there's always danger in academia that very simple things and very simple concepts are represented in a way that is very complex and confusing. The second aim of the course is not only to give you this kind of historical development of this idea, but also to set a number of tasks for you to basically work through this concept that we will introduce on a theoretical level. As you already know, this course is divided into 3 units. The first unit is actually quite theoretical and abstract and tends to be very boring. I'm sorry that was actually necessary, because before we start talking about concrete manifestations and violations of human rights, we really need to know and have a basic grasp what these human rights are. So please bear with me, and if you have difficulties with the readings, there's another lecture that should sort of help with that, and of course there are discussions forums, and you can always email me with questions and observations, and I will be extremely happy to help you further tackle all these actually very difficult themes. So let's start with a question, and that is, what are human rights? This is a definition that I use most of the time, and I think it's a very nice summary of what human rights are. The problem with this definition, as with most definitions, is that it always reduces a very complex content into some kind of manageable whole. So I will try to expand on this definition and give you my own take on what human rights are. I will avoid being critical about them, because that's going to be a topic for the Unit 3, and my own research is basically working to see what are the pitfalls and the limits of the human rights discourse, not because I think this idea is flawed or bad, but rather because we experience that despite its theoretical grounding and a very prominent impact on today's politics, we also see how international capacity to enforce these human rights is actually failing. But leaving this aside, let's focus on positive aspects of it. So, for the start, human rights are a set of basic entitlements and freedoms that all human beings have, or ought to have, regardless of their nationality, gender, class, sexual identity or orientation, ethnicity, religion, language, or any other contingent aspect of our existences. What this basically means is that there is something inherently tied with being a human that in itself has value. I will expand this notion that every living being has equal moral value for our concern, but let's stick with the humans for now. As you can see, this definition basically has 2 parts that covers the whole discourse of human rights. The first part of the definition basically says that human beings, because they are human beings, have basic set of entitlements and freedoms that needs to be respected. What kind of freedoms and entitlements these are, we'll talk a little bit later in this lecture. The second part of this definition is basically saying that what human being is doesn't really depend on our nationality, doesn't depend if you're American, Mexican, Chinese, Serbian, Russian, or any other kind of nationality in the world. It doesn't depend on the gender differences. It doesn't depend if you're female or male. It doesn't depend if you're poor or rich or simply a member of a middle class. It doesn't depend on your sexual identity or orientation. It doesn't depend on ethnicity or religion or language or any other contingent aspect that basically in a concrete real life circumstances defines us as a specific person. The second question that follows this first one is, what are human rights for? I mean, what is their purpose? And later we'll see like what happened that they actually become a reality. So to answer this question is basically human rights are set of obligations that are placed upon governments and other people that aims to regulate their interaction and actions, actually, an agency of these institutions and other people towards other people. They have a prescriptive form. They're actually a command. They tell you what to do. And they prescribe these basic freedoms and define these basic freedoms and rights that each person has, and that governments and the people in power have obligations to defend, protect, and try to improve these freedoms and rights. Before I move on, I just want to make a really basic account what rights and freedoms are. Well, freedoms are basically our capacity to act. It is capacity to not so much do whatever we want, because some of us can be sociopaths and who like to enjoy hurting and causing pain to other people, but rather like these freedoms denote our capacity to live peacefully in coexistence with each other and still have capacity to make choices that are not determined by other people. So for example, if I'm in mood for Indian food today, one of the basic rights that I have is basically that I can take a walk, take a bike, or get into my car and drive myself to Swagat restaurant and order a really good Indian meal. So all of this kind of trivial freedom doesn't denote a very complex political right. It still tells you like what freedoms and rights are in themselves. These freedoms and rights are kind of universal. That means that they belong to every human being regardless of any kind of contingent determination. They're inalienable. That means that nobody can take these freedoms and rights away from you. They can violate them. They can put you into all kinds of torment, but that doesn't mean that these rights and freedoms do not exist. It's only mean that these people who are perpetrating violence towards you are ignoring them. That doesn't make them right, or doesn't make these kind of set of ideas wrong. And they're indivisible. That means that they cannot be taken away from you in a way that some kind of personal feature makes you less prone to have them or not. So we cannot divide between people and say, okay, these people deserve to have human rights and these are not. Although in practice this is kind of very complicated, and we encounter all these manipulations, violations in a way that show differently. These three aspects are basically setting forth what human rights are, and each one of them is encountering actually difficulties in a concrete political setting. Of course, there are different types of rights. As you can see, like there are civil and political rights. Civil rights are basically like personal freedoms, as I tried to elaborate earlier. And these rights usually restrict the powers of the government in respect of actions affecting the individual and his or her autonomy, and confer an opportunity upon people to contribute to the determination of laws and participate in government. One of the basic political rights that we all have is actually freedom to vote, freedom to determine like who will represent our country and who will lead our country. Here we have set of different rights. There are so many more, but let's start with these basic ones. Right to life, that means that nobody has right to take away your life. Right to liberty, that means that you should not be enslaved. Freedom from torture, freedom of opinion or expression, freedom of assembly, freedom of associations. Now, imagine that you're living in a society where these rights are not enforced or protected. Imagine that you don't have freedom to say what you mean. For example, that you can say that University of Michigan basketball team sucks, but if you say something like that you're gonna face a very harsh punishment from the authorities. Imagine that you cannot express yourself, that you cannot wear the clothes you want, that you cannot wear the type of haircut you want, that you cannot date the persons you actually like, but that all these things are determined for you in advance by authorities who are actually just other people, who are using power to manipulate and control other human beings. From this kind of basic set of rights, gradually there have been deducted another set of rights that, for example, economic rights, right to work, or right to have a secure employment, then social rights like rights to social security, rights to free healthcare, rights to food, rights to education, right to movement. That means that if you want to move from East Lansing or Michigan to California, that you are actually free to do so, that you don't need to ask for permission of anyone else. Then there are like set of cultural rights. That means that if you are, for example, Russian, that you have right to live according to your tradition, as long as that kind of tradition doesn't interfere with the freedom and liberties of other people. That you have right to have basically religious freedom and like practice religion based upon your own beliefs. Nobody can actually control you in that way. And all these freedoms are actually, especially these contingent cultural rights and liberties, are dependent upon the fact that your enforcement of these rights and practice of these rights doesn't actually violate rights and liberties of other people. The last part is actually something that is at the forefront of media today. I don't know if you're following what's going on in the Europe and Mediterranean, where there's a huge flux of refugees from the African countries and Middle East, and there's a question like what kind of rights these minorities and refugees and immigrants have. Are we obliged to provide them shelter, provide them aid, give them everything necessary for them to have a normal life? And so on and so on, although they're not part or they're not our nationality. The story gets a kind of more difficult because usually obligations depend on a very clear causal connection between a perpetrator, someone who is causing these conditions, and actually victim. So if we take into account, and let's be idealistic here, and let's take that US or Europe doesn't have any impact and doesn't have any responsibility what's going on in these countries, what's in my opinion wrong, because if you take into account colonial past and how this colonial past has affected these societies, we are directly or indirectly responsible for the plight and the deprivation of these people. But let's cast aside these historical instances and just talk about these kind of straightforward relation that we have now. If we are not directly responsible for the war in Syria, if you're not directly responsible for all these conflicts in Africa, Do we have actually obligations to help these people? Do we have obligations to provide support and aid and provide these necessities to people who are attempting to avoid and escape suffering of their own home countries? We will tackle these questions later throughout the course, but for now I just want you to think about it. And because your own opinion about these things will set the limits what human rights are and set the limits of your own understanding what kind of obligations these human rights set for the people. Let's talk about historical development of these human rights. Well, idea actually popped up very early in the antique. As you will see from one of the videos in the working materials and case studies, it started with work of the Greek philosophers, and they had this kind of idea that there are certain natural laws that are basically general, and they have impact on every human being, regardless if the person is a slave or a Greek or a Roman or anything else. This development has followed through 13th century England and 17th century England, and finally it reached US in 18th century and France, where these rights have basically received their institutional form for the first time. One can say without actually fear of making a mistake that this idea of human rights as we know it today has been motivated to be institutionalized after atrocities that have been taken place throughout the Second World War. Actually, we are talking about Holocaust, where around 6 million Jews and probably 10 million Russians and other Slavs, including Serbs, Roma people, homosexuals, and so on, have been industrially annihilated, where their extinction was basically organized as a very simple task that people say have in, for example, in factories. So you go to your employment position, you are working Mitchell's fish restaurant in Eastwood, and for example your task during the day is to serve I don't know how many people if you're a waiter or waitress. What was very terrifying about these instances of horror is not only that the extent and the number of people who were murdered, but rather like that there is some kind of banality of evil, where you see that in their annihilation there were involved very different aspects of German society. So, for example, as you will read from the readings in the second unit, they were mostly taken to these death camps by trains. And people who were like driving the train, who were commanding at the wheel of the train, were normal civilians. Then all the materials that have been taken from Jews and other victims were basically used for products in civilian Germany, like victims' hair, victims' gold, and clothes, shoes, and so on. So these atrocities that have surfaced after the liberation of these death camps were basically the main motivation why world needed something as Human Rights Declaration. These are the articles that basically cover the basic aspects of this declaration. So first, promoting and encouraging respect for human rights and for fundamental freedoms for all, without distinction as to race, sex, language, or religion. We have already talked about it. Universal respect for and observance of human rights and fundamental freedoms for all, without distinction, blah, 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 blah. All members pledge themselves to take joint and separate action in cooperation with the organization for the achievement of the purposes set forth in Article 55. Well, this Article 56 is extremely important because this all members are basically all countries that are part of the United Nations, and to my knowledge, these are the all countries, all recognized countries in the world today. So the first charter of the United Nations was basically the first cornerstone for the creation of an international system of protection of human rights. As you see, this kind of red part here basically flashes alarm and raises awareness that there's something very flawed in this charter and these first attempts, because it still didn't list a catalog of rights establishing only general principles. So, for example, that were compatible with state sovereignty. That means that the states, governments of these states still had the upper hand, and they could actually do whatever they wanted with their citizens. Not in a way that now governments are free to kill us, but the governments didn't have these kind of constraints that are set, that are aimed to be set by these human rights in order to sort of more effectively have impact on their conduct. And human rights have become an official concern from the international community, and this is a trend that follows up from 1945 up to date. So the first declaration was basically designed in 1948. The declaration basically means that we have come to identify a set of norms and values that serve to basically help human beings coexist peacefully and help this interaction between us and other people, our governments and other governments, result in a more peaceful future for everyone. The main problem with declaration is that it's not a treaty. That means there are no legal obligations for other countries to follow it. It's basically like a few of us gather together now in this course and we make our own declaration. We said, okay, we declare that in order for people to be free, they need to avoid eating junk food. Or we declare many other aspects that every person in this class ought to have for at the end of the course. So, does this declaration of our intent has any kind of obligations on our instructor, on our MSc, or on each one of you? I don't think so. So the same happened with this first Declaration of Human Rights. So as you can see here, like there are these two different notions. Like International Declaration of Human Rights means that there is still decision based on the national governments. What I will suggest that it's necessary to have universal. That means that these declarations transcend the national boundaries. They transcend the power of governments to have impact on these set of rights. Good things about it is that it was actually the first case and first attempt throughout the history to have one single document that will basically place pressure or commit every country sort of to follow these set of ideals. It also set a universal standard of interaction and not just international standards of achievements for all peoples in all nations. And of course, the side effect of all these things is that slowly raised awareness of issues that were usually being ignored throughout history, like, for example, racism in United States of America, racism in the South African Republic, racism in Germany, sexism, and of course these dire instances of human rights violations like direct violence, torture, and so on. Some of the articles of these Universal Declaration of Human Rights are here. So, for example, Article 1 is, of course, setting the ground for all the others. All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They are endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. Article 2. Everyone is entitled to all the rights and freedoms set forth in this declaration without distinction of any kind, such as race, color, sex, language, religion, political or other opinion, national or social origin, property, birth or other status. Furthermore, no distinction shall be made on the basis of the political, jurisdictional, or international status of the country or territory to which a person belongs, whether it be independent, trust, non-self-governing, or under any other limitation of sovereignty, and so on. As you can see, these articles basically set that what I summed up under my definition, set of these liberties and rights that ought to be followed. Now, this first declaration has served historically as the creation for legally binding instruments. So what does this mean is that after actually more than 20 years of negotiation, the world and United Nations have adopted two legally binding instruments. That means the two legally binding set of rules and norms that guide interaction between people and governments. First of all is International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and the second one is International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. As you can see, both of these are basically covering all these different rights that we had listed in the previous slide. With time, these rights and these set of values have been received different legal representations and different legal shapes, and these shapes differ from country to country. For example, the set of social rights will differ from, for example, from the United States and from the other parts of Western Hemisphere. For example, one of the major differences between US and, for example, Western Europe or European Union is, of course, like the question of the healthcare, question of free education for the citizens. So now imagine you don't have to pay thousands of dollars each year to MSU, but the state is actually funding your education. And so on. So these are the list of the treaties that have actually followed from that kind of universal declaration that has taken in place in 1948 and has subsequently been improved and subsequently has gained in complexity and has gained the range and phenomena that it aims to address. So, leaving these things aside, let's just ask what went wrong. So despite this huge international focus on human rights, we still see that these rights are being violated on a daily basis almost everywhere. Why? How? What can we do to stop it? These two questions, why and how, will be basically part of the Unit 2, and what can we do to stop it will be actually theme for Unit number 3. For now, I'm just going to say that despite few attempts in the recent history, the history of human rights protection is actually very unsuccessful history. And when we face all these dire instances of human rights violation, you will see that the capacity of international community to deal with these issues is actually limited by many other factors like the economy, political engagement, and we will see actually that reality in itself is far away from fitting this ideal picture that these human rights discourse wants to push forward. Finally, this is a task 1 for the Unit 1, and what I want you to do with this is basically start the discussion forum and start making your first post there, and basically I want you to focus on only 10 rights that you believe that all people have. It doesn't really matter which rights. You don't have to repeat all the... You have to probably repeat some that we have mentioned in this lecture. Then you need to rank them from 1 to 10, and the 1 is the most important right in your opinion, and then 10 is the least one important. After you do that, you need to go to the detailed discussions and write up your list and give basic explanations why you have chosen these specific rights and what has motivated you to rank them the way you did. Don't worry, again, take these discussion forums as an environment where you will learn and where you will explore your own findings and share it with other people, and share it with me, of course, as your instructor, and use these discussions forums not so much as the grade determining aspect of the course, but rather like a medium where you can actually learn and benefit from the interaction with the others. So at the end, here is someone else's idea of what human rights are. Of course, as you have seen from this video, the last 10 rights are kind of not weird. They are justified. The claim to protect them is justified, of course, but unfortunately we don't really live in a world where enforcement of these rights is actually going to be completely possible, regardless of any other aspect like economy and national belonging and so on and so on. So what I wanted to do with this lecture is basically give you a short introduction that is actually not so short into what human rights are, what kind of rights are we talking about here when we talk about human rights, and please focus on the task 1, and you're free to use any kind of resource you can to do this task. Thank you for your attention.